For my next project, I've decided to do a skipjack, and at least that's what we call it in Tennessee. It's actually known as a hickory shad, but it's going to be almost 11 inches long. And what I've done here is I've downloaded an image off the internet, and I'm going to transfer that to a block of redwood. And actually, I have the redwood divided evenly into two separate halves. And you'll understand that as the video goes on. Instead of permanently gluing these two pieces of redwood together, I take a little bit of hot glue and I just spot glue it together, so I can take it apart easily later, but it'll hold it together while I'm cutting. So here I am gluing it, and of course over to the bandsaw and cutting out the rough shape. I'm kind of disappointed that I chose redwood. I had carved with redwood years ago and had forgotten that it carves real nice, but it kind of has a strong grain, so you end up with some soft meat and kind of a hard grain. So when you get down to that final sanding and you think you're real smooth, you can run your finger across it and feel the grain. And even though I sealed it and resanded it, it required some additional work with some body filler. No big deal, but I think next time I'll select something different besides redwood. Now here is where I get most of my shaping done, is on this little belt sander. I love this little guy. I can take these blocks of wood and just kind of work them. I know made so many lures over the years, been doing this for almost 30 years, and I kind of have a feel of what shape I'm looking for before I even, start whittling. So here I am getting pretty close to the final shape that I'll want for the main body. When I get done here, of course, I'll be doing some hand sanding, but this will get me that fish shape that I'm looking for. These little guys are pretty cheap too. You can pick one up like Harbor Freight for, I think that's under $100, like 99 bucks or something, like 89 bucks when they're on sale. Here I'm finishing up some hand sanding, using some 50 grit here to kind of take off any little leftover ridges and whatnot. You don't see it, but I end up hitting it with some 150 as well, just to get her nice and smooth. And then it's starting to take shape. Look at that, it's starting to swim. Okay, so here I'm going to take and transfer the gill plate onto the lure and carve that. And what I do is I cut the gill plate into the distinctive segments that allow me to capture that realistic look at those particular places where the gill plate changes shape. I also do the eye socket the same way. It's really nice using these templates because you can transfer to both sides and get things to line up very symmetrically. Now, one thing I like to do with all my lures almost is I kind of like using an oversized eye. If you fish, you know that predator fish, when they attack their prey, they're looking to take it head first, and they're honing in on the eye. And so I typically like to make that eye nice and bold and realistic looking. If you notice, a lot of shad have a false eye, and this is to confuse the prey. But yeah, I like to put that oversized eye on there and make it look as real as possible. And one thing, I want to say to you guys out here who are making your own lures is, when you're looking to capture realism, one of the key components to that is paying attention to things like the gill plate. There's a lot going on. You'll see here in a minute where I'll do some foiling, and I've actually got a blown up picture of the gill plate, and I'm trying to transfer some of those minute details into that foil so I can get as much realism as possible. And of course here I'm just taking a Dremel tool and cutting the eye sockets out. Later I will actually come back in and add some Bondo to those eye sockets, and then take an actual three-dimensional eye and push into that Bondo, and that'll give me a even more realistic looking eye, because if you look at the eye of a fish, you actually notice that they don't have flat eyes. There's actually some muscle tissue behind the eye. Okay, now I'm carving the gill plates, and those lines that I transferred onto the wood there, I'm just taking a single cut right down the middle of that line, and then I come back and cut a V shape on that line. So I'm cutting both the left and right side of that line, and what that does is that allows me to get the impression into the wood. And then the gill plate is made up of little plates, I guess you would say, that actually have radius to them, and I'm trying to capture all that detail, so I have to put a radius on those plates at the edges of them. I know one of the cool things about making a realistic lure is when you get to this point and you've got the shape and you start cutting detail into the gill plate and you've got the eye socket in, it really starts to get a hold of you that, hey, this is coming together, and I really enjoy this part of the lure making process. Now here I'm getting ready to cut my foil, and I realize that my lure is just slightly larger than my foil, and I decide to go ahead and use the foil anyway, and I'll have to come back and hand carve the scales that won't be trapped in the foil when I impress them in. And actually, before I get going with the foil, I remember I haven't sealed this thing, and once I seal it and sand it, then I realize, ooh, that grain is just too rough, and I end up having to add some Bondo. But here I am sealing it. I just used some polyurethane and brush on a real generous coat and let it dry and drip dry, and then I do another, and once it's dried good, I sand it. But even after I did all that, I was talking earlier about the grain, it was just too much, so I mixed up some Bondo, and I'm going to share a little secret that I learned here with this Bondo. When you're putting Bondo down, it's a very tacky substance. You can't touch it or you get it everywhere. What I figured out I could do is I can take and pour a little bit of a powder on it, like a baby powder, or I'm actually using some of that glass beads. It's a real fine glass powder, and once you put that on the surface of it, you can touch it, and you're tack free, and then you can just kind of feather that Bondo, make it nice and smooth, and it saves you a lot of sanding. And that's what I end up doing here, and I'll do it again when I add the pectoral fins. It's a pretty cool process. It's helped me a lot in the years, just kind of repairing things and helping finalize some shapes on things. Okay, so here I'm going to do some foiling. I've got the foil cut out, and I made me a little tool out of copper. That's just a piece of 1/2-inch soft copper that I have cut some angles at the end to give me some finer points, and I squeeze the end so it's flatter and gives me a tighter radius, and I can take that and buff that tool. I'll take some of that SOS pad or whatever, that Brillo pad, and buff that tool so I don't have any rough spots when I'm working that foil down. And then when I get done, of course, any imperfections in the foil are going to be transferred to those rubber molds, so I make sure I buff it out good with the Brillo pad. Here I am doing the other side, and when I do these big lures like this, I like taking and doing the body separate from the head. Just get a better foil job, I think, when you divide it there. There's a lot going on around a gill plate, and I like to take my time with it. One of the things that I have a great admiration for are the guys that carve these lures and sometimes decoys and things, and they actually hand carve in every scale. And boy, I tell you what, they do some beautiful work. My hat's off to Marlin Baits and Solar Baits. Those two guys can really produce some high quality carvings, and they have the patience just to cut in thousands of scales, and I just don't have that. So what I'm doing here is I'm building a scaling jig, and this right here is going to be the nest. I'll have a right and left side, And this will hold the lure in place while I actually impress the scales into the foil. And as this unfolds, you'll see what I'm talking about. And I decided when I commissioned this jig that I would build it in one piece, and I would just have one jig that I could set aside. And after working with it for a while, I ended up deciding it's just too long, and I ended up cutting it in half. But what I'm doing here is creating a nest, and I've got the plywood there screwed to and glued to a base, and I'm just taking some basically plaster of Paris, mixing it with water, and seating the lure down in there to create a nest. While that's still a little bit damp, I can just scrape off that extra and work with it real easy. The reason I'm doing this is because when you're scaling a lure, the way I'm going to scale it, it doesn't always completely scale the first time, and you don't want this metal mesh that I'm going to use to move around, and you don't want the lure to move around. It's critical that they both stay fixed. So I've created some little doors that will be cut out the same shape as the lure, and they'll hold the mesh, and they will fit snugly into that nest and trap the lure in. That way I can actually take the lure out and inspect it, and if I see where I didn't get some scales in the depth that I want them, I can put it back in and do some more work on it. And that's just a 1/4 inch luan, something you would use maybe to prep a floor before you put vinyl down, something like that. Now here I'm working the metal mesh. It's 1/4 inch aluminum metal mesh. It's used in the pottery clay industry where they do sculpting and stuff. I'm sure it's used in other industries as well, but that's where I've found it, and I think I ended up purchasing this through Amazon. But that's what I'm doing right there. Is I'm creating a little trap door that'll have that mesh built into it that will allow me to actually, scale that foil. And it's critical that you keep that mesh as tight against the lure as possible, because you don't want any slop. And so I work it pretty good down in through there. You should made me a little tool, and, make sure it's snug against the lure. It's nice too because you can end up using the same jig to paint with, So now you've got 3-dimensional scales, and then you can go in and paint highlights right on those scales so that the scale highlight lines up with the scales. Some of you guys who do custom paint jobs and you put scales on for people, and the lure actually has scales on it and they don't line up, it's kind of frustrating. So this is how I create my lures, so I can do that. And here I'm just putting some masking tape down on the nest to protect it from the glue that I'm going to use to glue the mesh to the door. In this instance, I end up forgetting to lubricate that tape, and it ends up sticking to the glue, and I end up having to peel all that off. It's no big deal, but I get it right on the next one. Now here I'm using 5-minute epoxy, and I like the light Loctite epoxy. It seems to work real well with the things that I'm doing. It seems to have a lot of strength. Another guy I recommend you checking out is Engineered Angler. He's done some tests with twisted eyelets using 5-minute epoxy, and it's had some real success. It's a powerful glue. It holds really well. Okay, so here I'm clamping the door down. I want that snug and flat and tight, and let that glue dry while it's down there and firm and tight, and that'll give me a nice snug fit. And you can see that hinge there I just added. There's no good footage on that, but I basically just epoxied it down. That door's too thin to put screws in, so I just epoxied that hinge down there. There's not going to be really pressure on it. And there I'm taking that tape off. I should have lubricated it. It took a little while to get all that tape off, but I finally get it all cleaned up, good enough for me, and get it right on the next one. Now here I'm burnishing those scales into that foil. I'm taking that same tool that you see me put the foil down with, a piece of copper, and I'm just working those scales into that foil. Now it's time to do the other side. See, I made me a little tool there, a little tool I can push that mesh down in there and make sure it's snug against that lure. Now, you know, I realized after I was editing that I didn't have the foil on the head when I did this, and I built this nest. So that was kind of a mistake. It doesn't really matter. I've tried it since. The foil's not thick enough to make a difference, but it ended up holding the lure up a little bit. And really, it probably just made it a little bit snugger, so it didn't really hurt anything. But this time I get it right. I get the glue and stuff on there with a lubrication on the base, and it ends up working out a whole lot better. Now, you know, of course, the scales go across the head and everything. You could cut them right there at the gill plate if you want. I can just take and lay something in there, you know, piece of cardboard or paper or whatever to protect the gill plate if I'm worried about marking some scales up onto the gill plate. But I'm pretty careful with my tool, and I never have that problem. And there you see me just taking the Dremel tool. I'm just making sure I've got clearance all the way around that lure. I don't want it touching the lure. I want to be able to get my scales, get to them, access them with both an airbrush when I'm painting and that tool to, you know, impress them into the foil. Here again, I'm masking off to keep the glue from sticking. And like I said, this time I get it right. I put some Vaseline on there to lubricate that tape so that it comes off easier. There's another product I like using too when I'm lubricating and using as a mold release, and it's a wax-based spray. It's a food-based wax spray that you can use for, I guess, you know, like if you were going to pour chocolate into a mold or whatever. It's consumable, but it's real friendly to painting when you're done. You can just take some Dawn dishwashing liquid and it comes right off, and it seems to work pretty good. I use Vaseline where I'm worried about, you know, things sticking that are critical. But that spray is pretty nice because it leaves all the detail and everything. Gives a nice mist. You want to make sure you put the glue on generous enough to get down in the mesh and hold it good, but you don't want it squishing out and ending up gluing the door to the frame. You know, it's just that frame around there is just a piece of Luan the same thickness as that door, and you know, you get two glued together and you got a mess. So you just got to get the right amount of glue in there. I think this time you see me put the hinge on. Yeah, there I am gluing the hinge on. Just put some epoxy on there, making sure I don't get it in the joint. So now I'm back foiling the head of the lure, and this is, to me, this is one of the more important aspects if you're going for realism. If you want to set your lure apart and you want it to really pop, I think right here is where a lot of guys overlook the chance to really set their lure out and make it look nice. The gill plate has a lot of feature to it. If you get a picture, which I do, I show a picture here of the gill plate that I'm trying to match, and try to capture all that detail. I go to quite a bit of pain to try to capture that detail because I think it's what really sets the lure apart, at least part of it. There it is. And you see I'm taking a pencil and I'm putting little marks and impressions and divots and crevices and things to try to match that gill plate. Those are some beautiful fish, aren't they? I mean, they're just it's almost as if they have their own light source. They just radiate beautiful colors. I don't know if you've ever caught them before, but we used to catch them up here in Ohio where I live at a warm water discharge in the winter, and they would just glow. I mean, they'd be purples and greens and blues and pinks and just, I mean, looked like they were made out of light. And something else I do, I may have mentioned this earlier, but I take a little bit of paint around the eye too. I'll get that gill plate all worked out and everything, and I'll cut the foil out where the eye goes and add some Bondo. And what that'll do is kind of, I can tilt the eye out. The eyes usually aren't flat right to the body. They kind of have a tilt on them so they can see what they're eating, you know. And and they also have a little muscle tissue back there to move the eye. And so sometimes, you know, you can see it more distinct with some species than others, but I'll put a little Bondo in there and then press the 3D eye that I plan on using into that wet Bondo, and then after it sets up, pop the eye out. I'll lubricate the back of the eye. You know, they're usually self-adhesive on them, and I'll just put a little Vaseline on the back of them. So I'll stick it in that wet Bondo, let that Bondo dry, and then pop the eye out, and then I'll sand that lip of Bondo that it made kind of into like that soft tissue that matches the fish. And you know, it is a lot of work to try to capture all this detail, but I'm gonna pour a mold, and then I'll have that detail in for as long as I use this mold. So you know, the work's done up front, and then after that, it's, you know, you can make a beautiful lure without all the effort. And I don't know if I mentioned this either, but the reason that I'm making it a straight jointless body is because I want to be able to cut it into different segments and experiment with different baits. I've never had a chance to build a glide bait, and that's one of them that I'm going to be doing here is a glide bait. I'm going to cut that thing just about in the middle and make a glide bait out of it. But I'm also going to make a 4-piece wake bait as well out of it. So with that one lure mold, I'll be able to pull out, you know, 2 or 3 different lures. Now here I'm putting on the pectoral fins, and you saw me just basically cut out the pattern, put it on there, trace it onto the foil, and then I just add Bondo in that shape right there, and then I add that powder again and thin it down, and then I take a wire and just go, you know, kind of clockwise around in the radius of that pectoral fin, and just put little impressions from that wire, boom, 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 and it gives you a real nice looking pectoral fin. And I'm cleaning up the edges a little bit. I'll try to get a good shot of that at the end of the video, show you guys the pectoral fins, but it's a whole lot easier than trying to carve them from wood. Okay, so here I took the lure back apart, the 2 halves, and I'm putting locator pins. So what I'm doing is just drill, just a straight line of little divots, little 1/4 inch deep, 1/4 inch holes across the surface of that inside of that lure, and then I lubricate it really well with that spray wax and then Vaseline, and then I fill those divots with Bondo, and then put matching Bondo on the dry side, on the unlubricated side, right where those little divots are at as well. And then I squish the 2 together, let it set up, and when I pop it apart, I've got basically built-in locator pins on my lure. So you'll see why I do this later in the video when I'm making the mold. I'm just throwing some rubber bands on there to hold this thing, to line it up, hold it together, and so letting that Bondo dry. Okay, so now here I'm starting to work on the actual rubber mold. You know, I make tons of rubber molds, and what I like to do is try to save money on rubber. And so, you know, one of the tricks that I do is I basically confine my rubber to only where I need it. So there's only a small amount of rubber used in this large mold. So I'm basically making a wood box, I guess if you will, that goes around the lure, and just enough space there to add rubber to give me the actual shape. So I cut out the pattern of the lure, maybe a 1/8 inch, 1/4 inch bigger than the actual lure, and that'll be, you know, my 2 halves of the mold right there. So I'm going to need a base to set those halves on. So let's take some 1/2-inch plywood, glue, some hot glue, just something I can put the lure on. No, it didn't stick. Let's try that again. I'm going to be able to pop that off pretty easy, so melt that glue good. Pop that lure half under, let it set up. Okay, so now I can take and put that frame I just cut out over top of that, and you'll see that's all the rubber I'll need is that small amount of rubber to cover that, the lure. Saves me a ton of money on rubber. Now I buy that red rubber, that Mold Max 60, by the 5-gallon bucket, and it's not cheap. Okay, that gives you an idea what I'm looking at right there. So mixing up the rubber, trying to get as much of the air out of it as I can. And I like pouring from one end, and I don't like filling it completely up. I'll stop here and take a brush and work this in real good. Too many times I've trapped a little air bubble at a critical place, maybe an eye socket or something like that, and then find out that every lure I make, I've got to go in and clean out the eye socket before I can put a three-dimensional eye in there. The nice thing about that red rubber is it's a high heat rubber. It's a very firm rubber too. So that's another reason I like it. So I'm using, there's no back on the back of that mold. You just got a thin amount of rubber. Well, it's pretty firm rubber, so it doesn't distort very easily. So I can use that to make small thin molds, and then also I can pour lead into it, hot lead. So I use the same rubber to make my molds for my jig heads and for my lead inserts and things like that. If this particular lure requires a custom weight, I can make a mold for a custom weight and pour it with that same rubber. I almost screwed up there. I almost poured the rubber right on that without lubricating it. But you got to lubricate that half good, and if not, you're going to have trouble. You're not going to get that thing apart. It's amazing how well that rubber will stick to itself once it's cured. Here again, I like brushing it in. Okay, so now getting ready to pour my two halves. Got some resin there I'm mixing up. I'm going to add some flotation beads in there, some glass beads. Now to get that right size container there, all you do is just fill your mold with water. Just lay that thing flat there and fill it up with water, and then say, okay, dump that into a solo cup. That's just a pink solo cup. And mark where the water goes, and then cut the cup down to that size. And if you fill that up every time to that size of that little cup I got cut, that's the right amount of resin. And how I do my flotation is I do the same amount of glass beads as I do part A, and the same amount of glass beads as I do part B. And so you end up with a 50-50 ratio, basically. That's a 50-50 resin. So here I'm just taking and dabbing my fingers in there. I'm just filling the molds up where they're just slightly more than flush, and then closing them, and that'll give me, I don't have to worry about injecting the mold. I don't have any ports in there to fill or anything. So here I'm demolding, taking out, and you see it flashed. I had a little too much resin, but not much. It's just paper thin, that flashing is. Just cleaning up the mold a little bit. Just take a little razor knife and shave that little flashing off. Just about breaks off. And because I put the locator pins in, I can just pop that thing right together. It lines up perfectly. So there's the finished product. Come out nice. Very happy with it. I've already made a glide bait and a swim bait from it, and I'll try to do a video on how I weight my baits. It's another nice little trick I can show you that helps get your weights just right. Well, first lure's finished.